thank you for taking the time to come and talk about the Clone Wars. This is a really amazing opportunity to hear from both of you. I wanted to start from the very beginning and talk about the creative impetus in 2005 after you finished Revenge of the Sith. And just a few short years later, we had a full season of the Clone Wars. What was it that inspired you to move Star Wars into a weekly television animated series? And what was it that you really wanted to achieve?
Well, I've always been interested in animation and everything, and so it seemed like a natural to explore the Clone Wars because we just barely touched on them in the movie. And I thought there were a lot of stories there that would be very interesting and could sustain itself for a TV series.
Dave has told the story of when he first met you and he interviewed with you about this job. I wanted to ask you if you had any recollections of what your first impressions of Dave Filoni is. I'm sure everyone here who works with Dave would love to hear it, if you can recall.
I can't. I'm an old man now. I must have liked him because he got hired.
You two worked together so closely for so many years on the Clone Wars. Do you recall maybe one of the best pieces, if not the best piece of advice that George ever gave you? And I'm going to hand you my microphone because we're sharing.
Oh, no, there's a lot. I mean, the teaching wasn't just outward for the audience. I mean, I think that we learned a lot every day. That was the big deal with this show. We must have drove you crazy in the beginning with what we didn't know. And the big difference was how patient George was at teaching us all these things about film. He would send us to watch certain movies and we'd rent DVDs and start to just upload this whole vocabulary. The second episode you saw tonight, Landing at Point Rain, was at first a total disaster. And George, Jason Tucker, and I sat in Avid for 2 days recutting that episode with live action footage. George had Battle of the Bulge, The Four Feathers, Battle over Britain, and we took a bunch of stock footage and footage from movies that he had and literally cut that episode together out of live action footage. And that's why the pace of it feels so fast. And up until that point, we hadn't really done anything like that in animation.
I wanted to ask you about the medium of television versus a feature film. And do you find it more challenging with Star Wars doing a weekly series, or is it somehow more forgiving in terms of longer character arcs or more episodes?
There's nothing forgiving. We weren't making this for television. We were making it for the big screen. I said, think of this as a feature. Everything about it, the style, attention to detail, the lighting, everything is done at a feature level, even though it's going on television. Being young and impressionable, he said, well, you can't do that.
Did I say that? Would I say that?
I would just do that. How are we going to do that? It's impossible. Especially like after we cut that sequence.
Yeah.
It was like about 600 shots more than what they had in the first place.
And you were right.
And you did it, as you go through and do that, eventually you get the hang of it, and then you don't say that. But I always keep them on their toes. I always say, here, that was hard. Here's something that's even worse.
Yeah.
I think one of the most important lessons, which I gave you in the beginning, which was, and Francis Coppola taught me, he says, look, if you can't write, you can't direct. Because all you're doing is telling a story on film, but the story is still the same. And if you don't know what the story is, and you don't know how to write the story, you're not going to know how to direct it.
Yeah, there were two things I can remember very plainly. One was that you would watch stuff we did all the time and go, what are you trying to say? What does that mean? And I would explain it to you, and you'd say, that's great. Everything you said, do it there. Because you're not going to be at people's home to explain it to them. And I remember, they seem very simple, basic things, but you get so lost in the process of making these stories, and you get it in your head that everybody knows what everything is, and you just kind of lose your way. When I got here, I was an animation director that did storyboards, and then the second week of working here, you said, we're not going to do storyboards. And I was like, I have a 2-year lease in Mill Valley. How unfortunate. But I had to learn to really make movies. And I think that's the big difference for me is I used to watch films and wonder why when we did animation, it doesn't feel the same. And I learned there's a world of reasons why that the mediums are different and how to approach it with editing and non-linear editing and coverage and shooting with heads and tails. And another big learning curve is just learning to pay attention to all that detail, all the little things. There was a whole other level of thinking the story through and framing shots and staging.
As we move into the future, television was taking off. And we started to have Netflix and we started to have things like that. There was a definite movement toward more sophisticated animation and more sophisticated stories.
The biggest thing you said way back when was the Clone Wars would be immensely more successful on a streaming platform. You were adamant about that. And when Clone Wars got put on Netflix, it exploded. And the amazing thing to me is all the things that you told me in the beginning in 2005 about virtual shooting, trying to do motion capture, a lot of things that we were trying to implement, which I didn't quite understand, but I was like, there's got to be something. I got to go with this Z-Viz, getting rid of hand drawing, not because we don't like it, but because it's just a different medium. And now we do all that stuff. And now everybody's trying to do all that stuff. Now I feel your frustration. What me must have been like, because they do the same mistakes that I remember making. And so that's what I do now. I try to teach people what I was taught because it works.
I say do or do not.
But I would try real hard.
I wanted to ask if either of you had favorite episodes or favorite story arcs. Anything just popped to mind when you think of the Clone Wars?
The episodes we did, if you ask my favorite, were the ones that were the least like any of the movies, because that's when we were actually being creative and challenging ourselves and doing things that felt more like Star Wars.
Well, my favorite, I can remember.
Really? I'm
Yeah,
frightened.
It's the one with the droids.
Oh, when they're out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
Oh my God, really?
It's THX White Limbo in Star Wars Land.
That one's up there, because who in the world would make that? You were describing this to us, and I was drawing those images in the story meeting of these bleak landscapes with droids questioning whether they were real. Just really bizarre. I remember once you had us do a whole 3-part arc on banking and banking deregulation, because kids are so into that. And
well, when I came in, threw that out. Everybody went, oh, God.
well, we didn't know what to, but I'll say this. I got to cover a wide range of topics directing on this show, which was really good as a storyteller. I wasn't doing just one thing. In some way, it really, really works. And I started understanding the value, and definitely watching a lot of movies. I can't stress that enough, because we did a whole episode based on Notorious. We did a whole zombie style with the Geonosians. We did a Godzilla episode because I like Godzilla. You threw that little bone in there for me. So that was really fun. But we did.
That was Rodan.
Not Rodan. No, that's the flying monster. We did Godzilla. We did Godzilla. You're just giving me a hard time.
Animation, although it's a different medium, it is cinematic. It is just like film. You took uniform, faceless, nameless, numbered clones, and you gave them a real sense of individualism and personality. Can you talk about why that theme is so important in the Clone Wars? Because it is such a staple of the show.
Even though they're clones are people. Everybody starts out the same, but in time, as they grow up, they change. One of the keys in doing a movie is you got to recognize the characters.
That was a big challenge, and luckily we had an actor in D. Baker who could do it, and we came with the idea that we could have one guy play them all, and he actually could. You forget when you're watching it that it's all the one guy. In fact, sometimes he's playing good guys and the villain too, which is then really mind-blowing. But yeah, that was a visual challenge. It was an acting challenge, and military personnel have a huge affinity for the clones. It really struck a chord with military families, because that idea of being part of a whole but also an individual strikes a very important chord for them.
And certainly from a story perspective, you dropped some amazing contributions to Star Wars and the overall story of the prequels. And the first thing that I think of is the breakout star of the show, which is Ahsoka. And I was wondering if you can talk to us about the sort of creation of Ahsoka, and when you were first coming up with the idea of giving Anakin a Padawan, what was that creative process like in terms of getting us to where we were at the beginning of season 1?
It just came kind of naturally, since we've been dealing with Padawans and Masters and things. It would be interesting to see Anakin with a Padawan. And she was, a tough little teenager. She was sort of the student position, but she wouldn't let Anakin tell her anything. She'd question everything he asked her. She'd stand up to him, and sometimes she'd outdo him. So it was a dynamic relationship.
And sometimes she'd fail, which was the best episodes where she would learn something. And it was tricky because you had this precocious teenager. When you watch the early episodes, she really feels like a teenager, being young and a little bit over the top. And later on, when she's matured, for an animated character to have this kind of personality arc is almost unheard of over so many seasons. So that really worked out. And again, you being the knowledgeable master filmmaker and me, the apprentice, it was easy to try to understand the relationship in the story that we were telling. I think from animation, one of the great things was you never treated the animation as something separate or different. It was just all part of the story. And that meant a lot, because a lot of times in animation, you delegate something else. Oh, it doesn't need to be as good, or it's just that animation thing. And we kept pushing to say, but we want the visuals and the story to just be an extension of the films. That's art. That's evolving. You never want to sit still. I mean, that's why the last season of the show looks better than the first. We kept pushing it and pushing it, pushing it. We actually found ways, Athena found ways to make the show less expensive while making it better looking, which is a win all around, because that wasn't the most important thing, how much money we were spending on it. We wanted to be tight and lean and effective and tell good stories efficiently, because then we could put that more into development and develop technology to tell the stories even better. So then you're putting your resources where they really need to be, instead of always making up for mistakes or errors or reshoots. You put where the value is.
Thank you. Thank you.